The turmoil over the BBC's effective suspension of its highest paid presenter, Gary Lineker, has intensified in the last few hours after the presenters of some of the corporation's other football programmes pulled out. The former England player had been told to step back from hosting the BBC's flagship football programme, Match of the Day, in a row over his social media use. He had tweeted criticism of the UK government's new policy on asylum seekers. Match of the Day is set to be aired later today without a presenter, pundits or any of its regular commentators. And in the last hour, the former England women's international and presenter Alex Scott has confirmed she won't be presenting the BBC's Football Focus programme today, and on-screen presenters and pundits have withdrawn from the Final Score result show as well. Our media correspondent David Silito has this report.
We've got big games at both.
Gary Lineker, the face of Match of the Day for more than 20 years. But not tonight. The BBC says he's crossed the line with his recent tweets. Also missing will be Ian Wright and Alan Shearer, who have pulled out in solidarity with their colleague. And a number of commentators and players have also indicated they won't be contributing. The trigger for all of this? Gary Lineker's recent tweets, one of which described a statement from the Home Secretary as beyond awful. The BBC says he's broken the rules on impartiality.
If Gary Lineker breached the guidelines, why didn't you sack him?
Well, I think we always look to take proportionate action, and that's what we've done.
But haven't you just kicked it further down the line? Aren't you delaying the inevitable?
Well, I don't want to add to the statement. I think we've had very constructive discussions. The statement's very clear, and that's where we are. As editor-in-chief of the BBC, I think one of our founding principles is impartiality, and that's what we're delivering on.
This is not what Gary Lineker was expecting. Earlier this week, he said he wasn't fearing suspension, and he was looking forward to presenting this weekend. One of those furious with the BBC is Alistair Campbell, who now has a podcast produced by a company in which Gary Lineker is a major shareholder.
I think this decision is driven by an utterly craven political cowardice at the top of the BBC. And that is what has led to Gary Lineker. And this thing about, stepping backwards, let's be absolutely frank about this. It's been pretty made clear to Gary Lineker, I would imagine, he's not going to be presenting Match of the Day because he's not towing the line.
The BBC says Gary Lineker is, as a sports presenter, second to none, but want him to stop tweeting about politically controversial topics and say he will remain off-air until an agreement is reached.
As a sports presenter, he's not subject to the same rules as I was, or you were, or you are now, or I was when I was at the BBC. But he is still the face of the BBC. So I would suggest there has to be some rules. What these rules should be, I thought, should be a matter of agreement between him and the BBC.
Gary Lineker, however, has not given any indication he's about to agree to be silenced. David Silito, BBC News.
Well, let's take a look at those BBC guidelines on this. Among many sections of guidance, one specifically refers to public expressions of opinion by those associated with the BBC. It says that for programme makers, editorial staff, reporters or presenters primarily associated with the BBC, their public expressions of opinion have the potential to compromise the BBC's impartiality and to damage its reputation. This includes the use of social media and writing letters to the press. Opinions expressed on social media are put into the public domain, can be shared and are searchable. The guidelines continue. The risk is greater where the public expressions of opinion overlap with the area of the individual's work. The risk is lower where an individual is expressing views publicly on an unrelated area. For example, a sports or science presenter expressing views on politics or the arts. Well, let's get the latest on this now with our correspondent Damien Grammaticus, who is in front of BBC headquarters here in central London. Damien, more expressions of support for Gary Lineker in the last few minutes from presenters and pundits on other football programmes.
Yes, exactly. So this issue is snowballing fast and a real problem for the BBC's Director General, who you heard there saying that he stepped into because he viewed it as a matter of impartiality. Well, now what he's seeing is football pundits, commentators, all coming out now in solidarity with Gary Lineker. So we've heard Jason Mohammed just now saying that he is not going to be taking part. So those in the match of the day, football focus, the afternoon football programmes, the roundup programmes, the highlights programme later in the day, all of those now in question. Alex Scott, another one, she's been saying today as well that she won't be taking part. Ian Wright, former England footballer, often appears as well. He comments on his own podcast, which was actually, I think, recorded just as this whole thing was happening yesterday. He has said that if Gary Lineker goes, I'll be gone too, he said, and he's very clear on that. He said Gary Lineker should be able to say what he believes on his own social media channel. That should be something that he's allowed to do. So snowballing in that sense, snowballing also in the sort of political sphere too, because we've had Labour stepping into this, opposition Labour Party. Someone walking past saying, bring back Gary Lineker. The opposition Labour Party, Lucy Powell, the shadow culture secretary, she's been on the BBC this morning. She's very upset. She says this is a mess the BBC's got themselves into, bowing to a Tory campaign to cancel somebody who disagreed with their views. She was drawing then the connection, or the sort of parallel she said she drew was with the BBC's own chairman, Richard Sharp. And she said, so in that case, what she said was, that I noticed the same critics of impartiality, who, talking about the Gary Lineker case, she said, were completely absent when the BBC chair failed to disclose his ties to the PM. BBC chair Richard Sharp, appointed by Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, and during that appointment process, he did not reveal that he had been involved in making an introduction to facilitate an £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson. That's now under investigation. Richard Sharp is also a donor to the Conservative Party, but so the opposition now saying, well, what about impartiality in that sense? And in all of these ways, the one decision by the Director General about Gary Lineker has snowballed into a much, much bigger question of his own decision-making and political pressures and impartiality in his own actions.
Yeah, so how are BBC bosses going to sort this out, Damien? Because the longer this goes on, the more it snowballs, the trickier it is to do that.
Yes, so it's an interesting question, and it is one that many are looking at, wondering, because the BBC's position has been that, and the Director General's position was to say that, well, there's discussions ongoing with Gary Lineker and he will not be back on air, is the Director General's position, until there is some agreed way forward dealing with, I guess, Gary Lineker's use of social media and what he says outside that programme. Gary Lineker has shown no sign that he's prepared to apologise or change his position. You've had one former head of editorial policy at the BBC coming out today saying he thinks those are unreconcilable, those two sides are unreconcilable, and that may mean that Gary Lineker ends up leaving. If so, does Ian Wright then go? So that then creates more problems. Equally, you've had a former Director General who was on the Today programme this morning, Greg Dyke, also formerly head of the FA, the Football Association, saying that the BBC said he repeated that BBC's got itself into a mess. He said it's undermined its own credibility. His view is clearly that impartiality rules should only apply to news and current affairs staff in the sort of entirety of those rules. Others involved in sports and entertainment, and like Gary Lineker, who is a freelance or a contractor to that one football programme, should be treated differently. That's how he would want to see this sorted out.
OK, Damien, thank you very much. Well, Damien was talking about some of the political commentary on this story, and Shadow Culture Secretary Lucy Powell spoke earlier to the BBC's breakfast programme.
Well, look, this is a mess. I think the BBC have got itself into a real mess here in bowing to a Tory campaign to cancel somebody who disagreed with their views.
What evidence do you have that this is a Tory campaign pressuring the BBC, telling the BBC what to do with one of its presenters?
I think that's fairly clear for everyone to see.
I don't think it's clear. How is it clear?
Well, we've had ministers on the airwaves, Conservative MPs on the airwaves, boosted by their friends in the right-wing media with a particular campaign about a presenter on the BBC, which initially the BBC didn't respond to in this way. So the sort of time that it's taken them to respond in this way, I think shows that they have capitulated to a Tory cancel culture. The same MPs and ministers, by the way, who only last month were standing in the Commons saying that they were the standard bearers of free speech. And I think this is a misinterpretation of what impartiality is. Impartiality is independence, particularly, I think, showing independence from pressure from the government of the day and Conservative MPs and ministers. And impartiality is about taking a principled position of an overview, not about individuals' comments outside of their BBC presenting job, unless they are, like you are, in news and current affairs. And I think there is that distinction.
And we have asked Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser to join us on BBC News Today, but a Department for Culture, Media and Sport spokesperson said individual cases are a matter for the BBC. We have also asked the BBC to give an interview to BBC News Today.